that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. My name is Teodor, and I am writing to you from Romania, specifically from a region that most people outside of Eastern Europe have never heard of and would struggle to locate on a map without a great deal of squinting. I understand this completely. If you asked me right now to point to the state of Wyoming with any confidence, I would hand you back the map and apologize. And I remain personally unconvinced that a place called Tallahassee exists outside of someone's imagination. Geography is humbling for all of us regardless of which direction you're pointing. So let me tell you where I come from and why it matters for what I'm about to describe. Romania sits in the part of Europe that the rest of Europe tends to forget about until something goes wrong there. Wedged between Ukraine to the north, Bulgaria to the south, Hungary to the west, and the Black Sea pressing against our eastern edge like it has somewhere else to be. We are a stubborn and deeply superstitious people who have survived centuries of occupation by developing a talent for endurance and an even greater talent for dark humor. If you tell a Romanian that things could be worse, they will look at you with an expression that says they already know exactly how much worse things can get and have drawn up a detailed list. We are not pessimists. We are people who have been paying close attention. The region I come from is called Maramureș, a mountainous area in the far north of the country that borders Ukraine and that has always existed somewhat independently from the rest of Romania in terms of its customs, its rhythms, and its relationship with what people politely call the old ways. Deep in this region, accessible by a single road that the county government has been promising to resurface since approximately the early 1970s, there's a small town built around a valley that locals call Vârful Negru, Black Peak, named after the dark granite ridge that towers over the eastern end of the settlement and casts a particular quality of shadow over the lower streets in the late afternoon. The town has perhaps 800 residents, a market that operates on Thursdays, two churches of different denominations that have not spoken to each other since an incident involving a boundary wall in 1962, a timber mill that employed most of the working population through the communist period, and a salt mine that has been operational in various forms since the medieval period and that provides the other major source of employment. I grew up there. I left at 22 and have not gone back to live there since, though I visit my grandmother twice a year and she makes sure I eat enough to sustain a man twice my size before she lets me leave. I tell you this so you understand that I am not a tourist describing a place I visited once. I am from there. I know the specific way the fog comes down from the ridge in October. I know which families have feuded with which other families across 3 generations. I know the particular silence of the valley on a Sunday morning. And I know what happened during 10 days in March of 1987, which is the reason I am writing to you now. To understand what happened, you need to understand something about Vârful Negru during the communist period, which in Romania ran from 1947 until the Revolution of December 1989. Romania under Nicolae Ceausescu was not the same as Romania under a more relaxed communist government. Ceausescu was a different category of ruler entirely. He was building his vision of a new Romanian society with the enthusiasm of a man who had never once been told that his ideas were bad, and the consequences of this for ordinary people were severe in ways that accumulated over years into something genuinely crushing. The Securitate, the secret police, had informants in every workplace, every apartment building, every social gathering of more than 3 people. Rationing meant that basic food items were available only in limited quantities regardless of what the state-run shops claimed to stock. Heating was rationed. Electricity was rationed. Women were legally required to produce a minimum number of children to contribute to the state's demographic ambitions, and access to contraception was controlled accordingly. Saying the wrong thing to the wrong person in the wrong context could mean a conversation with a Securitate that you might not fully recover from. In Vârful Negru, specifically, the tension between different groups within the town had been building for years before 1987, and it was building around a specific source of conflict: the salt mine. During the communist period, the mine had been nationalized and expanded significantly, and the expansion required the demolition of a section of the older part of town, a neighborhood of traditional wooden houses that dated back several centuries and that held a particular significance for the older residents. The families displaced by the demolition were rehoused in concrete apartment blocks on the western side of the valley that were functional and entirely without character, and the resentment this generated was profound and lasting. The mine workers who had been brought in from outside the region to manage the expanded operation were predominantly from southern Romania and were, in the perception of many longtime residents, receiving preferential treatment in terms of housing allocation, ration book categories, and access to the better supplied shops. Whether this perception was entirely accurate is something historians can argue about. What matters for the purposes of what I'm telling you is that it was widely and sincerely believed, and belief is what drives behavior. Layered beneath this contemporary grievance was something older. Maramure's has a tradition of folk belief that has persisted through every political system that has tried to discourage it, and in Varfel Negru, the particular local tradition centered on what are called the Dome de Piatra, the Ladies of Stone. These are not benevolent figures. They are described in the oldest accounts as women who had been wronged by the community and who had retreated into the mountain, from which they periodically emerged to settle scores that the living world had declined to settle on their behalf. There are specific rituals described in oral tradition for appeasing them. Offerings left at the base of the ridge on certain nights, particular behaviors to avoid in the weeks surrounding the spring equinox, prohibitions around working the salt after dark. Under communism, these practices were officially classified as superstitious remnants of a feudal religious culture and were actively discouraged. The younger generation largely abandoned them. The older generation performed them quietly and without advertising the fact. And in the years leading up to 1987, with the demolitions completed and the outside workers installed and the resentment at a steady simmer, certain older residents began to say privately that the town had stopped maintaining its obligations and that this would eventually be noticed. I do not believe in the Dome de Piatra. I want to be clear about this. I'm a trained civil engineer, and I believe in physical explanations for physical events. But I also grew up in a place where the line between what is believed and what is real is considerably more porous than in other places I've lived, and I have come to understand that a community's belief in something is itself a real and consequential force regardless of whether the thing believed in actually exists. The first event happened on a Tuesday evening in early March of 1987, during a period when the temperature in the valley had dropped far enough to freeze the smaller streams, and when the roads in and out of town were passable but unreliable. A man named Grigor Antal, who worked as a shift supervisor at the salt mine and who had lived in Varfel Negru his entire life, walked into the community hall where a mandatory political education meeting was being held, the kind of meeting that everyone attended because not attending was worse than attending, and produced a hunting rifle that he had carried in under his coat. He fired it 3 times into the ceiling, which sent approximately 60 people diving for the floor and behind the furniture. And then he stood in the center of the room and delivered a speech of approximately 4 minutes in which he described in specific and articulate detail exactly what he thought of the regional party secretary, the mine's appointed director, the demolition of the old neighborhood, and the allocation of priority ration books to the incoming workers. He named names. He cited specific incidents. He was precise and organized, and had clearly been composing this speech for some time. Then he put the rifle on the floor, sat down in one of the chairs as though he had finished a business presentation and was waiting for questions, and waited for the Securitate officers to arrive. They came within 20 minutes. He was taken away without resistance. The room he left behind was entirely silent for an extended period before anyone moved or spoke. What Grigor Antal had done was not an act of violence. The shots had been fired at the ceiling specifically to ensure no one was harmed. But what he had done was in some respects considerably more dangerous than violence. He had said out loud, in a public place with witnesses, exactly what people had been thinking privately for years. He had named the names. He had described the grievances. And the Securitate, faced with 60 witnesses to a speech that could not be denied or reclassified as a private matter, was going to have to respond in a way that everyone in town would see. Grigor Antal was not seen again in Varfel Negru for many years. What happened to him in the interim is something I was told about only much later and do not have space to address fully here. The town absorbed this event in its characteristically contained way. People went back to their lives. They did not discuss it in places where discussing it was inadvisable. They noted it privately and filed it and waited. The waiting is important. Varfol Negru had a particular collective capacity for absorbing shocks and then waiting to see what came next, a capacity developed over centuries of being a small settlement in a region that larger powers periodically decided to do things to. You learn to wait. You learn to reserve your response. The problem was that the next thing came before the waiting was finished. 5 days after the community hall incident, on a Sunday afternoon when most of the town was either at home or making the cautious social visits that are the primary form of winter entertainment, a woman named Elena Duma was found in the river that runs along the northern edge of the valley. She was alive, which was in the circumstances remarkable, having been in the water long enough to develop serious hypothermia. She was recovered by 2 men who had been crossing the bridge above the point where she was found and could offer no coherent account of how she had come to be in the water or how long she had been there. The river at that point was shallow enough that she had not been swept away, but the temperature of the water was low enough that another 30 minutes would almost certainly have resolved the question of her survival in the other direction. Elena Duma was 53 years old, in good health for her age, and lived with her husband in one of the older houses that had survived the demolition by virtue of being on the wrong side of the marked boundary. She was not known as someone who took risks. She was known as someone who made excellent preserves and had strong opinions about the correct way to prepare certain traditional dishes, and who had served for 12 years as a reliable and somewhat feared member of the local school's parent association. She was, by every available measure, not the kind of person who ended up in rivers. She had no memory of anything after waking up that morning and starting her usual Sunday preparations. Her husband said she had left the house at approximately noon, saying she was going to visit a neighbor. The neighbor confirmed that Elena had arrived, stayed for approximately 40 minutes, and left in entirely normal spirits. The river was not on any route between the neighbor's house and the Duma home. There were no witnesses to whatever had happened in the interval between Elena leaving her neighbor's house and the 2 men finding her on the riverbed. She recovered physically. Whether she recovered in other ways is a question her family answers differently depending on who you ask. What the community registered was this. Within a week, a man had been taken by the Securitate and a woman had nearly drowned under circumstances no one could explain. 2 things. 2 shocks. Absorbed. Filed. Waited upon. The third thing was the one that broke the waiting. It was a Saturday, 9 days after the community hall incident and 4 days after Elena Duma's recovery. The town's population was going about a Saturday in the manner that the available conditions permitted. Reduced rations, cold houses, the careful management of relationships under surveillance. When late in the afternoon a family in the eastern part of town, closest to the base of the ridge, failed to answer their door when a neighbor came to return a borrowed implement. The neighbor, a practical woman not given to excessive concern, went to the window and looked in and saw enough to make her leave immediately and bring back 2 other people before she would go inside. The family consisted of a father, a mother, and 2 children. The children were 12 and 9. What the neighbor had seen through the window was the father, who was alive, sitting in the kitchen with a quality of stillness that was not the stillness of someone sitting quietly. By the time people went inside, it was clear that the mother was not alive, and it was equally clear that the father was not going to be useful in explaining what had happened. He was not injured. He was not, as far as anyone could determine, in a state that any available medical framework could describe cleanly. He was present in the room and absent from himself simultaneously. He responded to his name being spoken. He did not respond to any question put to him. He sat in the kitchen chair and looked at the wall for 3 days before the medical services from the near city arrived to take him somewhere with better resources than Varfol Negru's clinic could offer. The children were not in the house. They were found the following morning, having spent the night in the root cellar beneath the woodshed at the back of the property. They were cold and frightened and could say very little about what had happened beyond the fact that there had been sounds and that they had run. Neither child was harmed physically. What they carried away from that night in the way of lasting damage is not something I have detailed information about, and I would not share it if I did. 3 incidents. 10 days. A town of 800 people that had managed to pass years without significant violence, suddenly faced with events that could not be individually explained and could not be collectively absorbed in the way that the previous shocks had been absorbed. The waiting capacity ran out. What followed was not rational, and it was not irrational either. It was something in between, which is the most dangerous territory for a community to occupy. People did not panic in the way of crowds running in one direction. They panic in the careful, specific, sustained way of people who have been taught to be afraid of attracting attention and who, therefore, direct their panic inward and sideways rather than outward. The mine workers who had been brought in from outside the region began to be looked at differently. Not confronted, confrontation under Securitate surveillance was not a viable option, but watched. Watched in a way that Varfol Negru had always watched, which was thorough and patient and left no record. Whether any of those workers had any connection to what had happened was something no one knew and no one could establish. But in the absence of any explanation, people assembled their own, and the assembled explanation pointed in the direction it had always been pointing. The older residents, the ones who had maintained the practices associated with the dome, the Piatra, even through the years when maintaining them meant doing so invisibly, became quietly central in a way they had not been for a generation. People who had dismissed those practices as embarrassments, who had been grateful that their children were growing up in a modern socialist state that did not traffic in that kind of superstition, found themselves at the doors of elderly relatives asking questions and listening to answers without their usual skeptical commentary. The ridge looked different to people during those weeks. Or perhaps more accurately, people looked at the ridge differently. The dark granite took on a quality that it did not have in summer, that it probably did not actually have at all, but that the community's collective attention had lent it. Small things were left at the base of the ridge. I know this because I was 8 years old at the time, and I remember my grandmother taking me with her one evening and placing something wrapped in cloth at the foot of a particular stone and saying words in a register of Romanian that I recognized as belonging to a much older version of a language than the one I used at school. She did not explain what she was doing in terms that an 8-year-old could fully process, and I did not ask her to. Something in the quality of the evening made asking feel inappropriate. The mine workers maintained their routines and their caution and gave no outward sign of being aware of the community's attention. The Securitate conducted their investigations into the community hall incident, which had given them more than enough to occupy themselves with. The medical services removed the father to their facility in the city. Elena Duma returned by degrees to her Sunday visits. Grigor Antal remained wherever Grigor Antal had been taken. And then, somewhere around the 3rd week of March, the quality of the town's attention changed again. Not dramatically, not with any single event. The way that a fever breaks, not with a clear moment, but with a gradual recalibration that you only fully recognize in retrospect. People began to go to work again. Children returned to school. The Thursday market resumed its normal operations. The offerings at the base of the ridge were gradually discontinued as spring moved the snow back up the mountain and the valley opened to light for longer periods each day. I have thought about that period many times in the years since. I was too young to understand it while it was happening and old enough to have stored the memory of its texture. The particular quality of the air in our house during those weeks, the way my grandmother spoke in careful registers about careful topics, the absence of certain adults from certain places, the unusual pattern of evening visits between households that did not usually visit each other. It was only much later, when I was adult enough to ask questions and old enough to find people willing to answer them, that I assembled a picture of what that month in Varfol Negru had actually contained. What happened to Grigor Antal in his years away from the valley is not information I have entirely, and what I do have I will not summarize in a way that flattens it to fit neatly in a story. What happened in that house near the ridge on the Saturday afternoon of the 3rd incident was similarly never explained to the satisfaction of anyone who investigated it, including the Securitate, who had considerably more resources for investigation than the town doctor did. The explanations that exist are the ones that communities construct when official explanations fail to arrive or fail to convince. They are built out of whatever materials are available. Old beliefs, local knowledge, the specific texture of a month that felt wrong in ways that were difficult to articulate and impossible to dismiss. They are not the explanations I would reach for myself. I'm a civil engineer. I believe in load-bearing structures and material tolerances and the behavior of matter under predictable conditions. But I also grew up in Varfel Negru, at the foot of a dark granite ridge, in a family that put things wrapped in cloth at the base of particular stones on cold March evenings, and said words in a language older than the state that was trying to make all such words illegal. And I think the most honest thing I can tell you is that both of those things are true simultaneously, that there are physical explanations for physical events, and that there are things a community knows about itself that no physical explanation fully accounts for. The fault lines in that valley had been building pressure for a long time. When a release came, it was terrible and fast, and when it was over, the town was changed in ways that were difficult to measure, but impossible to ignore. Whatever you want to call that, collective psychology, mass tension, the inevitable consequences of prolonged oppression expressing themselves through individual acts. It happened there. I saw the edges of it as a child. The center of it, I've spent years reconstructing from the accounts of people who were old enough to stand in it and still remember what it felt like to stand there. The ridge is still dark. The valley still fills with shadow in the late afternoon. The salt mine still operates, smaller now and different in its ownership and its workforce. The Thursday market still runs. My grandmother still makes preserves and has strong opinions about food preparation and does not speak about March of 1987 unless I ask her directly. And sometimes not even then. Some things that happen in a small place stay in that place, turning slowly in the dark like something that hasn't yet decided what to become. There are places where nothing happens for so long that when something finally does, the community has no framework for processing it. The small port town of Brila, sitting on the wide curve of the Danube in eastern Romania, was precisely the kind of place through most of the 1990s. The communist period had ended, the factories were slowly emptying, young people were leaving for Bucharest or further, and the town existed in a state of gentle economic decline that produced its own particular rhythm. Quiet, slightly melancholy, predictable in the way that struggling places tend to become predictable. The most significant event in any given month was usually a flooding dispute between neighboring properties or an argument at the Saturday market that someone's cousin was still referencing 3 years later. We were not a town accustomed to real disruption, which is why what happened in the summer of 2003 left a mark on us that has never entirely faded. It began with a girl named Mirela. She was 14, the daughter of a mechanic and a woman who worked in the post office, and she had grown up on one of the older residential streets near the river embankment. She was described by her teachers as diligent and quiet, by her classmates as kind in the unremarkable way that genuinely kind people tend to be, not performing kindness but simply operating from it as a baseline. She walked home from school the same way every day, a route of perhaps 20 minutes through streets she had known her entire life. One afternoon in early June, she did not arrive home. She was found 2 hours later by a man walking his dog along the embankment path, barely conscious and in a condition that I will not describe in unnecessary detail, except to say that whoever had found her had done something that required not one, but 2 surgical procedures at the hospital in Galatz, to which she was airlifted after the local clinic determined that what she needed was beyond their capacity. The surgeon who performed the operations spoke to the assembled press the following morning outside the hospital's main entrance, and he is a man I have always respected for his composure and his professionalism. He managed approximately 4 sentences before he stopped, pressed his hand briefly over his eyes, and needed a full minute before he could continue. He delivered the rest of his statement, that the surgeries had been successful and that Mirela's life was not in danger, in a measured tone of someone who has decided that composure is a form of respect for the person they are describing. The press conference footage circulated widely in the days that followed, and I have never been able to watch more than a few seconds of it. The investigation was handed immediately to the county police, with assistance from the National Criminal Investigation Division, who sent 2 officers from Bucharest within 48 hours. Mireille's memory of the attack was incomplete in the way that severe trauma sometimes makes memories incomplete. She could provide fragments, impressions, directional information about where she had been when it happened, but nothing that assembled into a usable description of her attacker. The county investigators were thorough and visible, going door to door along the relevant streets, interviewing staff at the nearby businesses, making appeals for the local radio station and the regional newspaper. The school sent notices home. The community responded with the full force of a small town that has suddenly remembered how close together everyone lives and how little anyone actually knows about the person in the adjacent house. The paranoia that descended on Brilla in those weeks is difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it. We were not a community that spent much time afraid of one another. The town had its tensions and its grudges. Every town does. But the working assumption had always been that the people you passed on the embankment and stood beside at the market were not dangerous in that particular way. That assumption simply evaporated. Men who had nodded to each other for 20 years across the fence found themselves looking at each other differently. Women who walked the same routes Mireille had walked began altering their paths. Parents drove their children to school and waited outside to collect them. The post office where Mireille's mother worked became a place people visited not just for their usual business, but to stand for a while near someone who was connected to what had happened, as though proximity to grief was also proximity to answers. The county investigators gave press updates every few days that said, in various careful formulations, that the investigation was ongoing and that they were following several active lines of inquiry. Whether this was true or a form of managed uncertainty to prevent the town's anxiety from becoming something worse, I cannot say from this distance. What I know is that 3 weeks passed and no arrest was made. The summer continued its ordinary business of heat and river light and the smell of the Danube. And somewhere inside it, Mireille was recovering and her attacker was unaccounted for. Then a man named Constantine Viduva walked into his own house on a Tuesday evening and did something that ended the question of the attacker's whereabouts, though not in any way the investigators had planned for. Constantine Viduva was 61 years old. He had operated a locksmith shop on the main commercial street for 32 years, having taken it over from his own father, and was known in Brilla with the particular familiarity that comes from being the person everyone calls when they have locked themselves out of something. He was a thin, precise man who wore a canvas apron in the shop and spoke in the careful, measured way of someone who has spent decades working with small mechanisms that require exactness. He attended the Orthodox church on the street behind his shop every Sunday, without exception. He was, in the estimation of everyone I've spoken to about him, not a man anyone would have predicted anything unusual from. His son Florin was 23. He had finished his military service the previous year and returned to Brilla without a clear plan, working occasionally at the port and occasionally helping his father in the shop, occupying the intermediate space between his former life and whatever came next with the slightly restless energy of young men in that particular position. He was not, by the accounts of people who knew him, anyone who drew much attention. He was considered pleasant enough in the superficial way of someone you see around without ever quite seeing. On that Tuesday evening, Constantine came into the house after closing the shop. His wife Cornelia was in the kitchen. Florin was in the living room watching television. What happened in the next part of the evening is something that Cornelia has spoken about only once in a statement to the police and has not revisited publicly since. What is known is that Constantine and Florin had a conversation that lasted approximately 20 minutes, during which Cornelia remained in the kitchen and heard the tone of the voices change but could not hear the specific words. She heard Constantine's footsteps on the stairs, then a pause, then a single sound that she described to the investigators as not fitting into any category she had previously known. Then silence. She found Florin in the living room. Constantine was seated in the chair by the window with his hands resting on his knees, looking at the opposite wall. The television was still on. Cornelia called the emergency number and then, in the particular dislocation of someone whose mind has separated from what their eyes are reporting, called her sister. It was the sister who called the police a second time and confirmed that someone needed to come immediately. The responding officers found Constantine exactly as Cornelia had left him, in a chair, hands on his knees, watching the opposite wall with the particular quality of stillness that is different from ordinary stillness. He did not resist being led outside. He walked with the officers to their vehicle and sat in the back with the precise posture of a man attending to some interior process that required most of his concentration. At the station, he stated his name, his address, and his age. He described the sequence of events with a mechanical clarity that the investigating officer described afterward as the most orderly account he had taken from anyone in similar circumstances in 20 years of police work. He confirmed what weapon he had used and how. He said he was prepared to answer any further questions they had. The further questions were primarily about why. The investigators asked this from multiple directions over the course of the following day. Directly, indirectly, through the framing of other questions that approached the subject from the side, through suggestions offered as possibilities to be accepted or rejected. Constantine Viduva declined each approach with the same quiet consistency. He stated that he had done what he did, that he accepted the consequences, and that he had nothing further to add on the question of motivation. He asked if he could be taken to the holding cell. He was taken to the holding cell. Officially, the case of Constantine Viduva remains a homicide with an undisclosed motive. The county prosecutor's office processed the matter with appropriate thoroughness. Constantine received a sentence commensurate with the charge. The investigation into Mirela's attack was formally maintained for another 14 months before being classified as inactive due to insufficient evidence. What Brila knows, which is a different category of knowledge from what the official record contains, is what everyone in the town had assembled within approximately 48 hours of Constantine's arrest. The connection between the two events was not established by any investigative process. It was established by the particular collective intelligence of a small community that has been watching everyone in it for decades, and therefore holds information about relationships, patterns, and histories that no official file captures. People knew who Florin had been seen with and where and when. People remembered things that had not seemed significant individually, but that assembled into a picture once there was a frame to put them in. The question that remains genuinely unresolved, the one that Brila returns to in the particular way that communities return to things they cannot close, is how Constantine found out. A father and a son had a conversation on a Tuesday evening. Something in that conversation moved a 61-year-old locksmith, a man of extreme precision and long habit and deep religious conviction, to do something that he must have known would end the life he had built over 6 decades. Whatever Florin said, or did not say, but was inferred, whatever passed between them in those 20 minutes while Cornelia stood in the kitchen and heard the register of voices change, was sufficient. There are theories. Some of them are plausible. Some of them reflect more about the people advancing them than about the event itself. None of them can be confirmed, and none of them have been denied by the one person who could deny them, who has maintained the same precise silence on this particular question in custody that he maintained in the chair at the police station on the night it happened. Brila has never fully returned to the working assumption it held before that summer, that the person beside you on the embankment is not dangerous in that particular way. The assumption is there in a modified form, slightly more provisional than it used to be, held with a small internal reservation that was not there before. Mirela, from what I have heard, recovered and moved away and built a life elsewhere. Whether she knows what happened to Florin Viduva, I cannot say. Whether knowing would mean anything to her is a question I am not in a position to answer. What I can tell you is that the locksmith shop on the main commercial street stood empty for 2 years after the summer of 2003 before someone else eventually took it over. The sign with the family name came down. The new owner changed the paintwork and rearranged the window display and operated the shop competently and without any connection to the history of the premises. Most people who pass it now have no particular association with it. But there are people in Brila who do, and when they pass it, they sometimes pause in the way that people pause when a physical location holds something they have never fully set down, and then they continue on their way, and the town continues its quiet life beside the wide curve of the Danube, where nothing much happens for long stretches, and then something happens all at once, and then the long stretches resume. In late March of 2003, when I was just 19 years old, I came home to find my mother sitting in the living room. I had spent the previous night at a friend's party with my girlfriend Layla at the time, and after one of my first real experiences with alcohol, I wasn't feeling my best. I walked through the front door into a house wrapped in complete silence and assumed my mother and sister were out, but when I headed toward the main room, I saw my mother sitting there motionless, staring into nothing, a cup of lukewarm tea in front of her. The scene was so strange that, through the haze of the previous night, I flinched when I spotted her. Then that surprise was quickly replaced by that familiar heaviness in the chest that comes when you're about to hear bad news. My mother never sat in rooms like that, silent as a statue. It wasn't like her at all. She asked me to sit down, and when I did, she told me that my father was gone and that he wasn't coming back. I asked if she meant he was dead. She shook her head slowly and said no. He left, just like that. I remember floating on a brief island of relief before sinking back into the depths of shock. And when I recovered my bearings, I peppered her with questions. How did she know? Where had he gone? When did he leave? And her answer to every single one was the same. I don't know. The harder she tried to say anything meaningful, the more she fell apart. He hadn't told her, hadn't left a note, hadn't said goodbye to anyone. He packed a single bag, got in his car, and drove off as though he were going to buy bread. The conversation ended with my mother in tears and me holding her, telling her everything was going to be okay. But I came to discover, unfortunately, that everything was not going to be okay. In the first 2 or 3 months, no one really talked about my father's disappearance in any real sense. There were visits from relatives and calls to check in on us, but the conversation centered on how we were doing, not on why he had left or whether he'd come back. Anything that brushed up against the mystery of it all tended to make my mother collapse to the point where she couldn't speak anymore. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel the same way. But once the initial shock wore off, a burning curiosity took the place of the pain and grief, one made far worse by my mother's deliberate and enduring silence on the subject. She wasn't in denial or anything, and people grieve in different ways, but whenever I brought up my father, she'd either burst into tears or explode in anger, shouting things like, "Don't you dare talk to me about that worthless man, he's dead to me." And so I had no choice but to seek answers elsewhere. Sensing that she was hiding something from me, I did so with great intensity. My first move was to contact Victor, my father's close friend, his only real friend, in fact. I figured he was the most likely to know anything about my father's whereabouts. My father was an only child, and both his parents had died before he turned 30, but he and Victor had been close since their university days, a friendship even longer than his marriage to my mother. I thought if anyone knew where my dad was, it'd be him. But when I called, Victor said my call was the first he'd heard of any of it. He had no idea why my father might have left, but he did know a few places he might have gone. And one of those places was a small village in northern Finland called Inari. I ruled out the possibility that my father had stayed in our city of Lyon in southern France, since he had stopped going to work. I then looked into his hometown of Toulouse, but as far as I could tell, he wasn't there either. And only then did I consider traveling all the way to Inari, the most distant of the 3 potential locations. That would mean crossing thousands of kilometers into the depths of northern Finland. Victor said my father had spent a summer there during his final year of university and had spent years longing to go back, often mentioning his wish to return one day. According to Victor, if something like a sudden midlife crisis had come over him, there was a good chance he had made his way to Inari. Inari, which sits roughly 300 kilometers from the nearest large city, has a population of around 7,000, the majority of whom are indigenous Sami people. There is 1 petrol station, 1 medical clinic, and the nearest police station is more than 150 kilometers away. It is the very definition of a remote town. But to me, that was good news because there'd be nowhere for my father to hide. I was warned against traveling in winter since temperatures can drop to -50 up there, so I made sure to plan the trip for summer. I arrived in Inari on Tuesday, July 16th, 2005, after 3 days of driving up from Lyon. There was no nearby hotel, and since I was only planning to stay for around 48 hours at most, I figured I could sleep in my car, which inadvertently led me to my first stop in town, the petrol station. Working there was a man named Oskari, who appeared to be in his 40s, with pale blonde hair and eyes the color of melted ice. He was warm and good-natured, and after some small talk, he remarked on how rare it was to get any outsiders coming through. I took that as my golden opportunity and showed him the most recent photo of my father. He didn't recognize him, but when I showed him the second picture, one I had dug out from among my father's belongings, he stopped cold. It was an old photo from what must have been his university days. My father as a young man, standing beside a young woman, both in hiking gear on either side of a large rock, pointing to a strange mineral vein that ran straight through its center. Oskari recognized the rock immediately. He said it was the Blue Ice Rock, a natural landmark about 15 kilometers outside of town. It had stirred controversy in the 90s when geologists came down from Helsinki to study it. The oral tradition of the Sami held that it was the bone of a giant being that had fallen from the sky in ancient times. The arrival of the geologists ignited a sharp debate. Some locals were curious to learn the scientific truth, while others felt that subjecting the landmark to such scrutiny was a desecration of their ancestors' beliefs. The studies ultimately showed that the rock was neither a meteorite nor mythological remains, but the geologists estimated that it extended deep into the earth, possibly for more than a kilometer, and no one had any convincing explanation for how it had formed in land that showed no signs of volcanic activity. I mention all of this because I was deeply curious about why my father had visited that place. I had no memory of him ever showing any interest in geology. Then, as Oskari looked at the photo a second and third time with that fixed, concentrated stare, he asked if I knew who the woman was. I said no. He asked if I'd mind if he held onto the photo and made a quick call. He told me he was about 80% sure the woman in the photograph was the same one who had gone missing in the late 80s near the Great Lake of Inari, and that her face bore a striking resemblance to the one he had seen on missing persons posters as a child. He added that I should visit the local government office to be certain, and that it was located inside the medical clinic. Since I had arrived late in the afternoon, I was told the office would be closed until the following morning. I spent the rest of the day wandering the quiet town before returning to my car to sleep. The next morning, I stopped by the petrol station for coffee and something to eat, swapped a bit of small talk with Oskari, and then walked over to the clinic. There I met Eileen, the head of the local Sami Council. She laughed and told me the official title was grander than the job, and that it was almost entirely ceremonial. She welcomed me warmly, and from the look in her eyes, I knew straight away that she would be willing to help. But what she had to tell me was not what I had hoped to hear. Eileen, working out an office not much bigger than a closet, welcomed every rare visitor to the town and offered to answer any questions they might have. When I told her my story and showed her the old photograph, I watched her face shift from openness to a cold expression that bordered on something like fear. Then she said quietly, "I think we should step into my office." I sensed she possessed valuable information, the exact kind I had driven thousands of kilometers to find. But what she told me raised far more questions than it answered. Eileen told me that the woman in the photograph was named Anita Forsberg, a graduate of the University of Turku in 1989 who had disappeared in the summer of 1990 during a camping trip near the northern shores of Lake Inari. She then pointed to my father in the photo and told me that he had been one of the suspects detained and questioned by the police in connection with the disappearance. Not once, but twice. That was shocking in every sense of the word. And yet, this may sound strange, it was the first time in my entire search that I felt I was holding something solid. I had spent roughly 18 months running into blank walls and dead ends. So even if the news was bad, the knowledge that my father had once been a suspect in a disappearance meant there was a real thread I could follow. I thought, perhaps he had made a late-life pilgrimage back here, searching for answers about the girl he had once loved and lost. It would also explain my mother's violent, furious silence whenever my father came up, suggesting she had known something about Anita all along. Eileen then added that Anita Forsberg's remains had never been found, and that no one had ever been formally charged. She mentioned that Anita's last known location had been the area the Sami people called the Voaska Lands, a vast marshy expanse to the northeast of the lake, where police had found her tent in perfect condition, yet completely empty of any trace of its owner. Eileen glanced at the newer photo of my father and said she hadn't seen him in town, but quickly added that if he were heading straight for the Blue Ice Rock, there would be no real reason for him to pass through the village, especially if it held the painful memory of being arrested. If he wanted to search for Anita, or simply stand at the last place she was seen alive, it made sense that he would have gone directly to the Voaska Lands. The problem was that getting there from Inari meant covering about 250 kilometers of rough terrain. Without a capable four-wheel drive, which I obviously didn't have, there was no point attempting it. And even with one, a 40-kilometer hike through Voaska's marshland still awaited me at the end of the road. I turned the situation over in my mind. I could rent a 4x4, drive to a certain point, and then walk for days through punishing wilderness. But my finances were in a sorry state. I had already taken a full week off work, spent heavily on fuel, overnight stays, and food along the way. I had two choices: cut my losses and return at a later date, or call my mother and beg her to wire me some money, then call work and risk my job by asking for more days off after already putting my manager in a difficult position at short notice. But being up there in the north made me feel close in a way I couldn't explain. I told myself I wouldn't be able to live with the regret of turning back. In the end, I called my manager first. That was the easy one. I was honest with him. My father had disappeared, and I was up north trying to find him, hoping to bring him home. He said, "Take all the time you need." My mother, on the other hand, was anything but easy to convince. She didn't know where I was or what I was doing, and when I told her, she was furious. She refused to send money and told me to come home immediately. I spent over half an hour in a heated argument, full of tears and silence and words said in anger, using the phone in the petrol station's back office, before she finally relented and agreed to transfer money. I'll be forever grateful to Oskari for giving me that privacy during the call. It was quite possibly the most intense conversation I've ever had, and I owe Oskari something even greater than that. He was the one who agreed to drive me north toward the area near the Voaska Lands, asking nothing in return but the cost of fuel. He had grown genuinely invested in my story, especially once I told him everything Eileen had said. But before we set off, he said something to me that I will carry to my dying day. He asked, "Your father went out looking for the girl. You went out looking for your father. Have you ever stopped to think about who's going to go looking for you?" A chill ran through me. I had never once given that a single thought, but the moment he said it, the words settled in my bones. On the drive north, Oskari's quiet practicality gradually talked me out of the idea of trekking into Voaska on foot. My father, at least, would have had basic camping gear if he intended to walk that far. I had no tent, no suitable clothing, no sufficient food. Instead, we decided to head to the nearest police station in the town of Sodankala to report my father's disappearance, leave my contact details, and hopefully learn more about what had happened to him and about his questioning in connection with Anita's case. The drive to Sodankala took about 4 hours. When we arrived, Oskari stopped at a grocery store while I went into the station alone. It was a small reception area with a larger room behind it. A young officer named Marty, about my age, traded a friendly greeting with me and seemed ready to help, but when he realized my inquiry went deeper than a routine question, he made a call to his senior colleague, Purdy, a pseudonym, and the reason for it will become clear shortly. The most experienced officer in the area. Purdy was older and more seasoned, and initially reserved, but he opened up gradually as I told him the full story. He said he remembered the Anita Forsberg case because he had been a junior officer at the time of the investigation. He remembered how my father had returned to town alone, how it was he who had reported Anita missing, and how the police had ultimately been left with no choice but to treat him as a suspect after the first round of questions. Purdy hadn't been present at either interview and didn't know how exactly my father had implicated himself, only that he had. He said all the files and reports were kept on site, but that he couldn't share them without official clearance, and that a Freedom of Information request could take months. He said, with a trace of weary irony that he hadn't spent nearly 30 years on the job only to lose his pension over a slip like that. It was frustrating, but also strangely cathartic. Even though I had traveled so far, I wasn't going home completely empty-handed. Both Purdy and Marty promised to keep an eye out for my father and to contact me if they heard or saw anything in the area near the Voska lands. Before I left, Purdy asked what my plans were. I told him I was heading back to Inari and would probably spend one more night in my car before driving south in the morning. He wished me luck, I thanked him, and then I walked outside to meet Oskari by his truck. He had picked up some sandwiches, and as we got back on the road to Inari, I gave him the full rundown of what the officers had told me. Oskari said he had been keeping me in his prayers, hoping I'd get my hands on those files sooner rather than later. I wouldn't call myself a religious person, not by any stretch, but sometimes I think Oskari's prayers found someone's ears. Because that night, as I was trying to get some sleep before the long drive back south, I was woken by a knock on my car window. When I looked outside, I saw a dark blue coat. It was Purdy. He gestured to me. I straightened my seat, opened the door, and invited him to sit in the passenger seat. When he climbed in, I saw him reach into his pocket and produce a small disc with a handwritten label I couldn't read in the dark. I had switched off the interior lights to save the battery, but I had a strong feeling it was something very specific, something he absolutely should not have been showing me. Purdy told me to open my laptop. I did. He slid the disc in, and my suspicions were confirmed. It was a scanned copy of the written transcript of my father's first interview, the one conducted before his arrest when he was not yet considered a suspect. In that first interview, my father was candid and forthcoming. He said that he and Anita had been camping near the marshlands when he was woken by the sound of her leaving the tent in the night. Seconds later, he heard her scream. He pulled on his boots in a hurry, grabbed a torch, and ran out into the darkness to find what had frightened her so badly. And that, he said, was when he saw them. One of the interviewing officers asked, "Who are they?" My father replied that if he told them, they'd think he was out of his mind. He then said something to the effect that if he had known they were out there, he and Anita would never have gone anywhere near that place. Not in a million years. One of the officers asked where they had taken Anita Forsberg. My father said he didn't know, but wherever it was, she was most likely dead. She had to be, because there was no way she could have survived what they were doing to her. Again, the officers asked, "Who are they?" And my father exploded. He asked them how they didn't know. "You live out here," he said, and other things that sounded completely unhinged. So much so that it was no wonder the officers concluded he had killed Anita Forsberg. The officers continued with a few more questions, but with each answer my father grew more and more agitated. He didn't know why they hadn't taken him too. He hadn't noticed anyone following them in the days before, and he couldn't explain why there wasn't a single drop of Anita's blood anywhere, despite his insistence that a violent attack had taken place. After that, the officers announced they were terminating the interview, and the transcript ended. When I asked Purdy whether he had brought the second file, he shook his head and said it wasn't worth reading. He explained that following what my father had said in the first session, the police had placed him under arrest on suspicion of Anita's murder. And in the second interview, once my father realized the officers didn't believe his account, he said nothing at all. He stayed completely silent until he was released for lack of evidence. He left town after his release and never came back. The search for Anita continued for 10 days. The team found a shared campsite intact, but with no trace of the girl. No clothing, no blood, no human remains. The search was eventually called off, and years later Anita's parents had her officially declared dead for legal purposes, and her name was removed from the missing persons register. But Purdy added a detail that had always stayed with him. Near the end of the search operation, one of the police dogs broke free of its handler and vanished entirely. The dog's disappearance triggered a secondary search within the larger effort. Officers combed the area high and low for both Anita Forsberg and the missing hound. Neither was ever found. The dog's fate was officially recorded as an operational hazard, mourned, then replaced. But Purdy was convinced there was far more to it than a dog getting overexcited and drowning in a marsh. He closed by sharing his personal theory. In his view, my father and Anita had stumbled across some kind of cultivation site, possibly drugs, and my father's volatile outburst during the first interview were a reaction to that. He was quick to add that he had no proof whatsoever, but that very little else explained some of what my father had said. After Purdy left, I lay back into a restless and unsettled sleep. It was strange hearing my father as a young man. He sounded a lot like me whenever I hear my own voice on a recording. But that, of course, is not what stayed with me through the night. It was what he said, and how he said it. On the drive back, I carried with me a strange tangle of sadness and fear. I had never felt so close to finding my father, and at the same time, he had never felt so distant. All his life, he had probably been carrying the weight of what happened in that Finnish marsh. I can't speak for my mother, because I still don't know how much she knew, but I had known nothing at all, until that moment. That was almost 2 years ago now. I'm writing this in December 2007. I'm still no closer to the full truth about my father's disappearance. But today I have a much clearer sense of where to look, and now that I can hold my own on a solo hiking trip, I think I'm just about ready to go looking for him. I'm planning to head back north in the coming summer, perhaps in July, and I'll write up everything I find. I don't know how many of you will read this, but I'm not really writing for anyone else. I'm writing for my own sanity. And when I find out anything new, this will be the first place I post. I expect to publish another entry in a few months. And if I don't, well, either I found my father or something else happened. I suppose we'll all just have to wait and see.